Hello, I'm Dr. Ron Charles, and thank you for tuning in today. When Jesus was about to begin his ministry, he selected some disciples. He selected 6 to begin with, and later on 6 more. And of all of those that were following him, he chose 12 of them to be his apostles. And some of the original 6 that he chose also became his apostles. But of these 6, Jesus wanted to teach them. He says, now you're going to be following me. You're going to be ministering on my behalf. You're going to be doing things with the people. You're going to be dealing with them. You're going to be talking to them, counseling them. And so you need to know where I'm coming from. You need to know what I'm saying. You need to know what I believe. You need to know what my Father demands of me and how that relates to your position of my disciple. And so he taught them on what we call the Sermon on the Mount. Now, whether it was done in one setting or multiple settings, it really didn't matter. This was the first teaching that he gave to his disciples who were going to follow him into ministry and who were going to help him in ministry. So there's a number of principles that are stated in this Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. But the bottom line to the whole thing, when he tied it all together and tied it in a nice little literary bow and says, this is the package, was in the 7th chapter. And in this 7th chapter, in verse number 24, this is the final conclusion that Jesus had to wrap it all together with the teachings that he had just given them. He said, therefore, whosoever or which ones of you hear the sayings of mine and doeth them, or to do them, not only hear them, but to do it, I will like him unto a wise man who built his house upon a rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon the house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. And everyone that hears these words or sayings of mine and doeth them not, we have a lot of people who hear from God, hear the words, the messages of God from the ministers of God, but they hear them, but they don't do anything about it. Anyone who heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them not shall be like a foolish man who built his house upon the sand, and the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon the house, and it fell, and great was the fall thereof. You know, Jesus knew exactly what he was talking about, and this particular story refers back to an actual physical event, and an event that was well known to the Roman world because it was part of Roman history, and an event that was also known by pretty much anyone that was under the control of the education system that was in the Roman Empire. These disciples of Jesus, they were from the Galilee. There was only one who was from Judea, and that was Judas. But the rest of these guys were from the Galilee and in the northern region. So it was mandatory for them. They were under mandate of the Roman government to go to Roman schools, to have Roman education. The Judeans, that was not so much the case. But in the Galilee, which was very much Roman, there's only 2% Jewish up there in the Galilee, then it was demanded that they go to Roman schools. So this was a well-known historical event that dated back all the way since actually the very founding of Rome, 500 and so years before this point. And actually, it was in the year 525 BC that these actual events really took place. And what happened is that the then emperor of the Persian Empire, Cambyses, was emperor of Persia. Now, this is right after Cyrus the Great had given permission for the Jews to leave Persia if they chose to, and he gave them a choice. You can either go back to your homeland, which Jerusalem and the surrounding area, or you can stay here in Persia, or you can go to our possession in Egypt, and you are welcome to do that. And so right after that, Cambyses, who was the new emperor of Persia, that following Cyrus the Great, expanded the territory of Egypt. Now, under Cyrus the Great, the territory that was under Persian control was what they call Lower Egypt, which is the Nile Delta, and down to approximately where Cairo is right now in present-day Egypt. But they didn't control the bottom portion of the state of Egypt, which was Upper Egypt. But Cambyses invaded the country, and he was intent upon bringing all of Egypt under the control of Persia, all the way from the Mediterranean Sea, all the way down to the borders of what is now Kenya, and which took in all of Nubia, which was Sudan and Ethiopia, and as well as South Sudan up into Kenya. And so all of that territory Cambyses was going to bring under Persian rule. Now, at the time, Cambyses was the pharaoh of Egypt, and he had his royal palace in the city of Thebes. Now, that city is now called Luxor today. And there's still ruins of that kingdom here, even there. And the royal city was quite magnificent. It had probably more gold and silver and jewels and that type of thing than any other city in the world at this time. And so Cambyses went through what is now Israel, as well as having a navy that went through the Mediterranean Sea and invaded Egypt in the Delta. He used Alexandria as his primary port of entry and his base of operations. And then he set out to now conquer Egypt. And so the top portion, the delta area of Egypt, was now already under Persian control, but he wanted the rest of it. And so the advisors to the Pharaoh told him, he says, Pharaoh, we advise you to move to the old palace. Now, Thebes had two palaces. A brand new one had just been constructed by the Pharaoh, and the original palace, the old palace, that had served as a palace for almost 1,000 years, and it was there. Now, the old palace was built on a rock outcropping that overlooked and actually spread out over the Nile River, and it was literally as hard as a rock and as stable as a rock, and it was built on this tremendous foundation, and it had endured everything. Attacks of enemy, storms, earthquakes, and it had proven itself able to take care of anything. Well, this Pharaoh, who called himself the living God, he was God on earth, as he called himself. He wanted a brand new palace. He wasn't content to stay in the old palace, even though it had served pharaohs for hundreds and hundreds of years, and had served them successfully and brilliantly. He wanted a new one. Now, in Egypt, and we have spent 32 years in Egypt, so we know a little bit about what they do there and the techniques they do there. Egypt has their biggest resource, I guess you could say, is sand. And the heat that penetrates the sand in Egypt gets hard as a rock. And the sand, the heat, the sun pulls all the moisture out of the sand, and the sand literally turns into sandstone, and it is just like it is hard as poured concrete, and and it is so compact and so hard that they literally do build buildings just by pouring concrete on the sand. And the sand itself is the foundation. And I've seen buildings that are built on this sand that are still in existence, having been there 300 and 400 years. And they're still stable. They're not cracking, and they're not falling or collapsing in any way because of them building on the sand. And so there's no problems with that there in Egypt. And so this new palace of the Pharaoh, he built it on the sand, and the foundation was built right on the sand. But because of the history of building on sand there, and how hard the sand is, there should have been no problem whatsoever. And so this was a beautiful campus. And it was a beautiful a royal palace. And so the Pharaoh lived there. Also, his harem that produced children were there living with him. But the harem that was the political marriages, in other words, you married a wife from Babylon or Persia or Syria, so forth, for political reasons. You don't have children with those wives because they're political wives. Well, they're in a separate harem. And so they lived in the original palace, in the original one that had faced all circumstances and had proven very stable and sound. And also some advisors lived up there. Some of the military lived up there. But the Pharaoh's immediate family and his immediate harem and his immediate children by them lived down in the brand new royal temple that was built on the sand. And so word came back to Pharaoh that Cambyses had crossed the border away from the territory of Persia and had invaded Egypt. Well, this Pharaoh says, I'm not concerned. I'm the living God. I'm God here on earth, and he will see the evil of his ways, and he'll change his mind. He'll be afraid of me, and he'll turn. And so as Cambyses sailed down, and as he came down the Nile River, and from Alexandria, where he came ashore, to Luxor or Thebes was about 700, a little over 700 miles. So there was quite a distance there that was to be traveled. So the reports came back regularly, if not daily, that Cambyses was on his way But the Pharaoh sent back word each time, I'm not concerned about this. I'm the living God. And so he will turn, he'll be afraid, and he will go his way. So I'm not concerned about it. The advisors would say, but your majesty, Pharaoh, your Lord, please at least move into the new, to the old temple, to the old throne room, and to the old palace, because it has proven itself. Your new one has not been proven. No one has ever laid siege to it. No one has ever fought against it. The old palace has proven itself. It can withstand anything by nature, anything by any king or any army that opposes it. It can withstand and it could be successful. But he refused each and every time. Finally, he continued to receive reports until one day he received a report that Cambyses had stopped his march from the north to the south, and that he had turned directly west. And then the Pharaoh told his counselors, I told you, he's fleeing now. He's afraid. He's afraid to attack me, so now he's fleeing for cover. He's going to leave the land of Egypt completely. He's fleeing into the desert, and so he is no longer a threat. But what Pharaoh didn't realize was this. Cambyses, his goal and his plan was to go to the west for a certain limited amount of time, and then when he got into the desert, he would then turn directly south and go and march his army south until he went beyond the city of Thebes, and then turn back west and attack the palace from the south rather than from the north. And this is exactly what Cambyses did. He went to the east, and he got to a certain position, which was about 100 miles out. And then he turned his army directly south, and he marched the 500 miles south that was necessary till he marched below. The city of Thebes was here on the Nile River, and he marched down below and then turned directly west until he got to the Nile River. And then once he got to the Nile, he dammed up the Nile River. Pharaoh received word that the level of the water in the Nile is getting lower and lower. And he didn't understand why. And then it came to him that by messenger, that Cambyses is now in the south of Thebes, and he is controlling the function of the water by damming it up. And Pharaoh says, oh, Cambyses again. Well, don't worry about him. He's afraid of me. Don't be concerned about what he's doing. And I am the God of the earth. I am the living God, and I will make sure that the Nile flows again. But the water kept getting lower and lower and lower. And then something happened that had never happened before. It began to rain. And not only did it begin to rain, it began to absolutely pour. I remember my wife and I were in Egypt, we're about 10 years ago, and when it rained for the first time in more than 100 years, and we were there in the desert when it rained, it only rained for about 2 or 3 minutes. But people went absolutely berserk. They thought the world was coming to an end because of the rain. The Quran talks about raining on the day of the Last Judgment, and so they were convinced. They had television programs that went off the air for special reports for the rest of the day, covering the 3-minute rain. because they were so terrified. But this was something totally different. This was real rain. And it began to rain in Thebes like it has never rained before. It rained for 3 days straight. Day and night, it rained. And then something happened that they had never experienced before. The sand became saturated, and then the sand began to melt. And those buildings that were built on the foundation of that sand began to crumble and began to fall. And they became weakened and were not able to withstand. And then in the very midst of this rain, Cambyses didn't know how long it was going to rain. He didn't know what was the function, so to speak, of the Nile River on what it would do in the midst of all of this rain. But in the midst of the rain, when the sand was beginning to melt the buildings, so to speak, Cambyses broke the dam. And when the dam broke, this huge 30-foot wall of water began to rush down the waterway of the Nile River. And this monster wall hit this new palace in Thebes. And when it hit this palace, whose foundation had already been weakened by 3 days of rain, I mean, it hit the palace, the magnificent, glorious, magnificent palace that was unpregnable and impenetrable. But this wall of water hit it with all of its rainstorm, and it came crashing down. And the Pharaoh, his children, his wives, the entire harem was wiped out along with everybody there. And in that palace that day, 1,300 who were there in the palace seeking refuge, knowing that the living God, the walking God on the earth, Pharaoh, was there to protect them. Well, it didn't work. He was not able to protect them against the violence of the water and the violence of the storm and the wind that was beset. However, about 20 minutes later, that same wall of water that wiped out that new, beautiful palace hit the old palace that was built on the rock, that was built on that rock outcropping that was overlooking the Nile River. And that same wall of water, the same wind, the same rain hit the old palace, totally flooding it. Water went over it, and it hit it with such force that it should have totally destroyed it. But once the water had gone away, and once it is receded, then everyone in the palace were safe because the palace was still standing. And that became the message that Jesus was talking about. He says, men, I have called you, and you can listen to my words. You can agree with me. You can adhere to them. You can listen and say it's good stuff. But unless you follow it, unless you do it, then it's no good. You're like the Pharaoh who built his palace on the sand, thinking that it was rock solid, which it was until it was challenged. But when it was challenged, it collapsed. So you can hear what I'm saying, and it will be good for you. But unless you do it, unless you put actions to the words that I'm telling you, unless you believe it and live by it and teach it and adhere to it, then you're like that palace that when it's under duress, then you will collapse and you will fall. But if you listen to me and you do it, then you can withstand anything, because you will. You'll be challenged. You'll be challenged to the nth degree. You'll even be challenged to the time of your death. But if you do what I tell you to do, and you not only honor my words, but do what I say to do, and live by these words, then whatever comes your way, you can withstand. Whatever may come, whatever storm, it's not going to melt your foundation. And whatever wind that is there that's going to destroy the greatest of the great, the wonderful of the wonderful, and the beautiful of the beautiful, it will not destroy you, because you are founded upon that rock. They listened to Jesus. They became those rock-solid disciples. And you can do the same. You are Jesus's disciples nowadays. You are his 21st century disciples, so you can do the same. You can have that rock-solid foundation. You can build on that rock-solid foundation by not only reading the words of Jesus, but doing the words of Jesus, letting them get into your heart, into your mind, into your actions, and letting his words be our daily communication and our daily goals in our lives. So not only to hear, but to do. That is the secret to make sure that your palace reigns supreme on the rock foundation. May the Lord bless you today.
Dr. Ron Charles has spent over 50 years researching and uncovering the truths about the life of Jesus and information that proves the historical authenticity of the Bible. Glean from his years of tireless work, research, ministry, and archaeological work, and watch the pages of the Bible come to life like never before. Go to cubitfoundation.org and place your order today. All proceeds go directly to Cubit Foundation's efforts around the world.